Did you just get done reading Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening and wonder, why is Robert Frost talking like Yoda? If so, you're in the right place, because today we're going to do a reading, summary, and analysis of this beautiful but highly debated poem. Let's start. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. You will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. So it's a very famous and a very beautifully written poem, but it's a lot more complicated than I think a lot of people realize. So we're going to break it down into its music and then its meaning and see if we can unpack some of the complexity of this piece. So first, its music. What I've done here is mark what's called the rhyme scheme. And if you take a look at it, you might notice that it's a little more complex than it seems on the surface. Every odd line out, so the third line, the B, becomes the dominant line in the next stanza, until of course we get to the end, and we'll talk a lot about the end. The other important thing in this piece is the meter. So meter is a fixed pattern of syllables that create rhythm. We use it in songwriting as well as in poetry. It's just in poetry you don't have instrumentals to back up the reading, but you can clearly hear it. And this specific meter is known as iambic tetrameter or common verse. It's used in a lot of hymns. It's used in a lot of kind of older songs as well as newer songs. And it's much like iambic pentameter. It's just 1 foot or pair of stressed syllables short. And you can hear it when we go through it on the next slide. We'll kind of emphasize it a little bit. So what I've done here is do some color coding here. It looks kind of pretty. And the dark blue is the meter, and the highlighted is the rhyme scheme as it follows. So I would argue that this rhyme scheme, other than just sounding really cool, has a very much build-up feel to it. And some people have even theorized that it's kind of akin to snowfall. Like if you look at the pattern, even like the lines are falling slowly on top of each other, building like a nice steady snow. But even if you don't buy into that, there's no doubt that Frost is directing our attention to that final repeated line, and miles to go before I sleep, not only because it's fully repeated, but also because it breaks the pattern. So that's very much an intentional thing that he's doing. The other interesting thing about the music in this poem comes from the meter, and I think it really kind of sounds like a horse's trot when you hear it. Whose woods these are, I think I know. And if you kind of put a beat to it, whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. So it kind of has this trotting motion to it, which of course matches the subject matter of the poem, this man with his horse stopping in the woods on a snowy evening. But what about the meaning of this poem? Because yes, it sounds very nice, but what is it trying to get at? The first thing that we can definitely tell about this poem is that there is specificity at play. In fact, everything about this poem is specific. These woods are deep, which means there's a lot of them, and Frost is very much a Vermont poet, and if you've ever been to Vermont, you know there are a lot of woods there. A lot of the state is woods, and it certainly was even more so during Frost time. So he could have stopped anywhere, but instead he stops at this very specific location, near a farmhouse, between the woods and a frozen lake. But not even, and there's snowfall as well, so it's specific weather, it's specific location, but even more so, it's a specific time, specifically the winter solstice. It is the darkest evening of the year, as we are told in line 8, and we know that to be the winter solstice, usually around December 21st, when we have the shortest amount of daylight. So this is a very rare occasion, and it's why he stops at it. What else is at play here? Well, one theory suggests that this is a poem about peace and beauty, and that the ending is kind of sad because the person has to keep going. So even when we are on vacation or with our family and we notice these, or friends, and we notice these moments of extreme beauty, we can never recreate them, right? I saw this all the time with my cousins who would visit in the summer, and we'd do something. It was a lot of fun, play a game or whatever. And then the next summer when they'd come visit, we'd try and do the same thing, and it just didn't click the same. You know, you can never kind of recreate those moments of joy in the same exact way. So the end of the poem, the miles to go before I sleep, could suggest that yes, this is a beautiful place. Yes, it is rare. Yes, it is fleeting and will never be this way again. But I have a job to do. I have a long ways to go before I get to go home at night, and therefore I must go on just within our lives. We can't stop and observe beauty too long, unfortunately, because we have miles to go as well. The other kind of theory with this poem is that it's actually about suicide, and that the sleep represents death. So here, the ending is hopeful, as the reader continues to live despite the temptation to do otherwise, right? The woods are lovely and they are dark and they are deep, but he has to keep going, or he decides he has to keep going. And it's a kind of a hopeful poem. So it's very interesting to me that in the first theory, the theory of peace and beauty, the ending is kind of sad, but in the theory about suicide or death, the ending is actually hopeful. So interesting nonetheless. I don't know exactly what Frost thought of the poem, but and it's kind of up to you. You know, whatever you take with it, as long as it's supported by the poem, you can argue for it. No matter what Frost thought, poetry belongs to the readers as well as the authors. I just think there's something remarkable about it, though, that, you know, it's lovely and it's beautiful and it's cold. And is it a poem about that finite moment in time, or is it a poem about freezing to death, which is also, some people would say, cold, right? And there's some overlap in these theories. So let's talk about lasting influence here. First off, if you've ever read Looking for Alaska by John Green, this is a very important poem in that piece. Young adult authors, and all sorts of authors for that matter, love Robert Frost's stuff. He shows up in The Outsiders, he shows up in Twilight, he shows up in Looking for Alaska, so all sorts of different books, because students know Robert Frost, right? So it makes sense that those characters in those books would be familiar with his works. So the main character in the novel is named Miles, and someone always calls him Miles to go before I sleep, which is of course a reference to the poem. And if you've read the novel, you can probably connect some of those themes to both the theory of peace and beauty or the theory of death in the poem. So it's a very well done allusion by John Green there. Another famous example of the poem is through John F. Kennedy. After he died, a famous broadcaster giving his eulogy during his funeral, or at least broadcasting his eulogy during the funeral, read this poem. And it's an incredible moment in American history. Kennedy was a huge fan of Robert Frost, and there was a poem, Frost wrote a poem for Kennedy's inauguration. And then in a very different presidential scenario during the 2016 election, the poem was parodied in kind of a mocking fashion of Donald Trump. So, like I said, poetry belongs to its readers, and you can do with it what you will. So, yeah, go ahead and check all those out. Very large range of emotions there. As always, feel free to subscribe. We always appreciate it if you want to see more poetry videos as well as other types of literature. And if you have any questions about the poem or want to discuss it anymore, do so in the comments. And yeah, let me know if there's anything else you'd like me to take a look at. Thanks for watching, and have a good one. Bye.